Good evening, everyone. Evening. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So quickly, of course, React is our Reveal.js always messes up on me. Here we are. So, like Brian said, my name is Gord Tanner. I am the co-founder and CTO at BitHound. So last year I gave a talk in Track B. I was the only person to release a religion called Forism on my talk on distributed computing. So this year I'm going to talk a little bit more about something that's a little closer to what I care about at BitHound. What we do at BitHound, we analyze code to look for quality and maintainability, and just trying to figure out what objectively and subjectively is good code. So what I'm going to talk, something that happened at our company is the concept of adding new people. We had 2 new developers coming on board, and the same day, and we were doing our kind of intro, the first 4-hour kind of chunk of the day, where I was getting their machines set up, talking with them, giving an overall architecture overview of how BitHound works. And something kind of cool happened that by lunchtime, even with talking, we had both of their laptops, which were just freshly opened at 9 a.m. out of the packaging, had our entire software stack up and running, and they were comfortable enough that we got a couple simple pull requests from them within that first day. And it really got me thinking about the concept of onboarding new people into our projects, and just that how to bring people on board and have them be contributing and be productive quickly. So another thing that that is important is that I'm going to be talking a lot about my experience with our closed source project or our application, but a lot of this information that I'm sharing also works and transpiles really nicely to the open source community, where in an open source community, new people coming on board to your project is in a largely asynchronous fashion. You don't necessarily have interaction with someone who finds your project on GitHub, clones it down, reads it, and tries to get up and running to add what they feel is value to their project. So there's a little bit more of a upfront cost with an open source project versus where in traditional closed source or like a company project, you have a face-to-face or at least an engaged communication dialogue between yourself and the new developers. So the key is as I was trying to figure out what exactly the topic of this, how to convey it, the one key thing I kept circling around to as I was doing the hallway track with everyone here and trying to explain when they're like, what exactly are you talking about, is that nothing what I'm going to say is new. There's not going to be a giant beam of knowledge transferred down where I'm going to blow your mind. We all know this. We all have this gut feeling of where our problems are in our code base, how hard it is to get running, those little gotchas that have tripped us up in the past. So another thing as I was putting together my slides was that there's not a lot of JavaScript in it, and that was unfortunate, but don't boo me off the stage just yet. So, welcome to the team. I want everyone to close your eyes and think about that first day on a job, that first time pulling down the code base to an open source project you want to contribute. And I'm sure I'm going to give you an experience of mine. I came into a company that I was really psyched about, and they kind of gave me my computer, and they said, all right, set it up. Here's the wiki for how to set it up. So I went to the wiki, which the last edit of this document of new developer machine setup was about a year ago. And I'm going through the steps, like step 1, install this version of SQL Server or whatever it was, and no one had that CD anymore, so I'm downloading the copy, and you can't find that version. And it was a step upon step of frustration, failure, and just misinformation. That it ended up, it was almost like a week before I even had something running. And so one of my jobs was, during that first day, is to update that document. All those problems you have while you're setting this up, can you just like add it to the document? So every company ends up with this amazing document written by people with about 2 to 4 hours of experience with the code base on how to set up a code base for someone who has 0 to 1 hour experience with the code base. And if you were to like think of any piece of your project that is as important as this, that you would give that much experience to, you probably want someone that like at least has like a day and a half experience. I mean, let's be honest. So let's go back to the concept. Like, git clone your team, your project. Now what? That is the entry point into our project. And realistically, first impressions matter. So, like we're talking, these are your new evangelists, these are your new teammates. And realistically, this experience, this onboarding experience, that first day does set the tone and the context for your relationship with that person. And you cannot do that over again. The impression that they're going to make during setting up your project, on your first day of their job with you, on their first time trying to contribute to this, is going to set the tone of their perceived quality of your code. And something that we always seem to forget about when we're bringing this, like these are usually a new machine, or a machine that isn't configured exactly like everyone else that's been working on this project for 6, 7 months or a year or so. And the key is we want to set people up for success. We want to set them on the right direction. We want to make sure they don't find those little caveats. We want to guide them into helping us, because new people, that's what you want. You didn't join the company because you thought it was horrible. You didn't want to contribute to this project because you didn't believe in its goals. So there's an enthusiasm there that you want to keep and foster into active and worthwhile contributions. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is documentation. I'll wait for you to leave. Documentation, not a really exciting topic, but extremely, extremely important. And something that happened in the kind of GitHub, the Bitbucket, the newer code hosting platforms, that was really subtle, but actually a really awesome transition, is that the README file became front and prevalent on the first page. If we all remember back to our older source control systems where they're online, there was some documentation, but it was always hidden in a folder or was on a wiki or somewhere. But now, at least with GitHub, with Bitbucket, with all of these online, the README is there front and center. And that is your entry point into working with these new developers. So if you're an open source developer and your open source project, use your README as kind of the how to install it as a user, how to use this API. But don't forget that you have the other half going in as contributors. And that's where the concept of a hacking file or a contributing, but at least link to it from your README. Because you want contributors. That's the healthy metric of a successful project. Now, this is where I sort of diverge a little bit from open source to closed source. So, one of my favorite slides. I love Flashdance. So, the whiteboard session, that first few hours sitting down, this is where documentation and experience really kind of diverge. We all have that idea of that mental map of our system, those little boxes we draw every time, the arrows going back and forth. That's a very important session to have with a new contributor to your project. Can't quite do it in an open source way, but in your environment, in your workplaces, having that time to walk them over the high-level architecture is invaluable. And I always say, for that documentation, I never want it written down in a permanent place, because it's going to be out of date by the time I'm done doing the whiteboard session. So next, with where your kind of help and documentation go are our command lines. So at BitHound, I have this kind of idea where I kind of throw around, I call it like command line driven development. I'm a terminal person. I love building together almost that Unix feel of smaller tools that chain together to do something good. And it's very important that they're documented. So you actually find, I would show it up here, but no one in the back would see it. But like all of our command line tooling for BitHound, from deploying to adding jobs to the queue, to checking status of servers, to provisioning new servers, all have internal help documentation built into them. Not like reams of documentation, but enough that you can at least figure out what the command would do and the arguments you need to pass to it. And those all get put into our README. But it's actually generated from another script that we have that has documentation that you can just run, and it scrapes all of our command line tools, builds it up, throws it into the command line.markdown document so that people have an idea of where commands are and how to use them and what is available. So next on the last kind of bigger topic of documentation is code comments. And this is something where I'm going to say things, and it might sound like I'm incredibly smart, but everyone in this room knows it. And I'm just kind of saying what smarter people have told me, is that there are a couple ways to comment your code. You can comment what your code does, or you can comment why your code does that. And we've all kind of seen those comments that kind of reference what the code is doing. But there's a better way to do that, and it's called code. So you can stop doing that. It's self-documented. At least try to name. That's where naming of your variables, naming of your functions, trying to have an expressive form of coding is a much better way of documenting in code. But with that being said, what that frees your code comments to do is to talk about the part that is really missing is the why. We can all look at code, and you can kind of look and go, okay, that's iterating over X and blah, 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 and then you call off to this little section over here. And the new developer coming in will be like, oh, well, I don't need to call over there. That's inefficient, and blah. And then you realize that the only reason you were doing that was 6 months ago that server kind of got overloaded, and let's just throw it off here so we can load balance it. That information is sometimes lost. So try to keep those little fugly places of your code documented about why it's fugly. Now, any talk kind of about this is I have a new bestie project, is Vagrant. I can't extol the virtue of this project as much. If you've heard about it, it's great. If you've used it, I'm sorry if you used it wrong, because it's not a welcoming project. You're going to have people like me kind of tell you about it, and you're going to be like, this is amazing. And you're going to start using it, and it's not going to feel amazing. And what Vagrant does, it gives you easy-to-script virtualized environments for your development environment. So rather than having your laptop or your desktop or whatever operating system, whatever permutation you have, Vagrant allows you to have a standardized virtual environment that your code is hosted in. And something that actually happened at BitHound that was really interesting was we do a very largely distributed platform. So all of our code that gets analyzed as we're processing your code gets sent out to a bunch of worker machines and handled and messaged back and forth. And we were working on this for a while before we launched at last JSConf. And I was working it on my laptop, and then we deployed it, and we came here, and we're like, hey, let's start letting people on. And I realized very quickly that what works well on one machine doesn't necessarily work the same when there's 200, 300, 400 machines. So some of those assumptions that I made in my configuration when I'm working here didn't quite scale when I was working in the distributed environment. So what this allowed me to do was virtualize a mini version of what production is, down to the exact operating system that we're running, to the fact that even with our local development, we're running Node in a multiple service instances behind the Nginx caching layer with it's hosting self-signed SSL certs. So exactly what's happening on production is what our local developers are using. And the job, when a job is queued, it goes through the same idea through the messages to a bunch of machines. So all those assumptions that we make that obviously this message will be handled by the machine that also handled this message so we can share things, which in a distributed environment is never true. Now, there's a key to using Vagrant, and this is kind of where my experience lies. Is as awesome as it is, you want to hide the fact that you're using Vagrant. The only thing that should really be evident when you're using Vagrant is when someone comes to you and says, my machine stopped working, you can say, run Vagrant destroy and Vagrant up. And they can create a new one, and you can ask, does it work? And they can say yes, and you can let them go back to what they were doing. So the way to do this is using port forwarding is the first thing. So yeah, I will hit localhost 8000, and it's served there. I can use the tools that I'm familiar with. Also, whenever you're using Vagrant, you'll have people say, oh, well, yeah, Vagrant up, and then Vagrant SSH into the machine, and run this command, and run that over here while you're developing, or run the build. That's where it starts to get icky. That's where those bad vibes you get from Vagrant. So this is something my DevOps guy kind of showed me that is good. So obviously, those at the back can see exactly what this says. But what this is a little proxy script we have where we basically run a command that it looks exactly like I'm running it on my terminal, and standard in and standard out goes to the virtual machine. So those just, it's very important. Vagrant SSH -- command and in quotes will execute the command. And if I go back to the first one, there's a little secret here, just for those at the back. There's a $sign. This one, $sign. And there's a star. $star. That is what is called a splat, or some people have called it some other things. But what that does is allow all the arguments that you're passing into the one command just to be like thunked right on to the other, into the command that you're SSHing to. It kind of really changed how we were doing our environment. So it got rid of all that crazy stuff. So now when you want to develop in BitHound, if you want to run a command, you're just running it in your shell on your host machine, and it's executing on whatever virtual machine it needs to, as well as if I wanted to run other commands that would interact with logs or other things. So going through this is kind of fun. I was going through our provisioning because it's all hidden. If you actually ever come work at BitHound or whatever, you'll see that all of our entire setup, you clone the repository and you run /configure, and it just sets everything up. And that's it. And eventually you have a thing, and right underneath, so like you ran /configure, hit localhost port 4000, because everyone forgets to tell people what port we host things on. And I was going through finding all those cases that would have tripped up. So this is kind of airing my dirty laundry. But you might have experienced some of these. So the first thing that was interesting was MongoDB, setting up a new Mongo instance. How many of you know that when you install Mongo, it doesn't allow remote connections? So the rest of you would have been screwed. So all this does is installs Mongo and does a little Perl script to comment out a single line in the config and restarts Mongo, and suddenly it allows remote connections because all of our workers are remote. So next, I was mentioning the concept of Vagrant is sometimes slow. So everyone will like install Vagrant and put their code in it, and they're running it, and they're like, wow, it's really slow. Well, Vagrant is kind of saying like Vagrant is slow is like complaining that like your minivan is slow. I mean, you're kind of missing some of the point. But what we can do with Vagrant, because reads are slow on the standard like mirrored folder, you use something called NFS. And so what this is, NFS comes installed by default on OS X, but not on Linux. So in our provisioning scripts, we just have, well, if you're running Linux, we'll install NFS, and it all just kind of magically works, and we have performance again. Another bug that was interesting was we hit this weird limit with Git. A lot of our commands are just kind of working with the Git command line or the Git kind of porcelain commands. And we hit up this weird like HTTP post buffer limit, and it was just, it only sometimes happened when we're cloning or doing something with larger projects. And it returned with like not a very helpful error, but we just throw it in our provisioning, in our setup script so that no one else ever has to worry about that. Like what usually happens is about 6 months after someone will start using our code base and playing around with it, they'll see this line with like a comment above it explaining why it's there. And they'll just kind of know like, why are you so angry that you had to put this in? Next actually is an interesting one. Is OAuth 1 has this really interesting quirk is when you're working with an OAuth provider, clock time is very important. So if your clock starts to drift from your OAuth provider's clock, you could suddenly all of a sudden like an OAuth application that's working really well locally, and you close your laptop, open it like 400 or 500 times, all of a sudden everything stops working, and you think it's that code you just edited, and you're like, how did I break authentication with like this change over here? You didn't. It was your clock drifted. So in our setup, we just update everyone to use a standard and like time server. Things like that's the things that never make it into those documents. And then lastly is, this is something I didn't even know was a thing, but there's a per file user per limit of how many files you can have open, how many handles you can have. So we would hit this every once in a while. So we have our own configs where we just dump them over so our processes can open like an obscene amount of files. So lastly, we all know developers are never wrong, and they always follow instructions to the T. And so I'll set up this amazing virtualized environment, this amazing place where they can work, and it all works the same. It's easy to set up. And then it changes. And we have to add in new dependencies, and we have to add in other ways of doing things, or we switch the caching layer. But like Jimmy, the developer over there, just updates his virtualized environments once every 6 months. So what this does, this is just, you can't really see it, but this is our start script. So we have a bin start, which goes and starts all the services, configures them all up so that the app is running on your local environment. And it actually checks a bunch of stuff. It checks a lot of these problems that we had. And it looks like a unit testing framework. It's in Bash. But if you like, this one's actually refusing to start because the version of your virtual environment is too old. And it just forces them to keep that bit rot from happening. Those older dependencies, last time they ran like npm install was like, I don't know, last Christmas. But it tries to keep everyone working on the same environment. So another thing that this is starting to get a little more opinionated is live reload. How many of you know what live reload is? How many people use live reload? For those of you who don't, so there's a bunch of ways to do this. The concept is you edit your code in your editor, and when you save it, there's file monitors, and it'll restart the services that are affected by that. So we use a combination of a few. There's NodeMon, there's live reload. They can integrate with Grunt or Gulp. And all this does is allow you to just edit your code, and it automatically will refresh your browser. It automatically restarts services. And it just gives you a really nice ability so you don't end up with people confused that, oh, I edited this source file, but I forgot to restart that like background processing job. So So this is an interesting one. So we all have unit tests. We all have acceptance tests. We all have smoke tests. And those are the ones we say to a new developer coming on, oh yeah, I just run the tests. And they'll always all pass, right? So what we forget to instill on them is how to actually test the system. So this is almost an extension of a whiteboard session where you actually show them how to use all those tools, all those tricks that you've gathered over the course of working with this project on how to test it, how to use a system as a user, and how to use the system as someone developing the system. There's all those like hidden places. So we have like dashboards that are available that we can watch the status of jobs. We have special command line arguments that we can pass in to simulate edge cases or to like shrink jobs. So rather than trying to like process a large repository and waiting 3 hours for it to process or whatever on a local environment, we can tweak the job a little bit to shrink it down so it's a little more iterative and 1 minute like time from start to finish. And that's not necessarily documented anymore, but that's something you want to pass on, or else you're gonna find that like that feature that you thought would only take a day for them to write, it's like a week and a half, and when you go to ask them, why is it taking so long? They're like, oh, well, every time I run this command, I wait 6 hours. And you're like, oh, just pass in dash dash, don't do that. So the last thing is always keep learning. The reason we bring new people into our projects is to learn from them. Your team doesn't have all the answers. Your team has a very interesting view of your project and how to run with it. So bringing new people on board is a great way to learn, a great way to bring experience and tooling and thoughts to help make this better for the next people that are coming on board. And I'm not talking about that first 4 hours. If anything, sit back and think about how hard it is to go from a brand new machine to working on your project, and try to make that easier for the next person. And hopefully we can just end up with a lot more cool projects. So lastly, in my shameless plug, BitHound, we do have a promo going on. I highly recommend signing up. It's 3 months free and 50% off for the rest of your life. If you sign up, promo code is JSConf 2015. The promo ends June 1st, maybe June 5th, who knows when we will remember to remove the promo code. But give it a try, even if you're not sure. I wouldn't want you guys to miss the opportunity for this promo code, so create a user, enter it in, and let's all make better code together. Thanks.